Sarah had been summoned before the High Council on a Tuesday, which she had always thought was a peculiarly mundane day for the end of a life. She stood at the iron threshold of the council chamber, 3 floors underground, carved from the same granite bedrock on which the Ashvale Pack had built its seat of power 300 years ago, and she felt the mark on her wrist pulse once, like a sleeping heartbeat waking. She pressed her thumb against it through the fabric of her sleeve. She had been pressing against it for 7 years, the way you press against a bruise, you cannot stop checking, and it had never once stopped aching. The council had summoned her for what she had done, or rather for what they believed she had done. But Sarah knew what this was really about. It was about the words she had said 7 years ago that no Omega in the recorded history of the Ashvale bloodlines had ever said before. It was about the night of the binding ceremony, the gold light, the Alpha King standing 6 feet away from her, with his hand extended, and the single syllable she had put between herself and everything she was supposed to want: no. She had said no to Caden Ashvale, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. And now, 7 years later, he was sitting at the head of the council table inside that room, and she was standing at the threshold, and every person in this building believed she was about to answer for her sins. She had something else in mind entirely. The door was black oak, banded in iron, and it swung inward at the touch of the warden's hand, without a sound, because everything in Caden Ashvale's world moved without resistance. She stepped through and felt the air change, cooler, heavier, threaded with the particular mineral smell of old pack magic that seeped from the walls like damp. 6 council members sat along the curved inner table, 3 pack lords, 2 bloodline keepers, 1 high arbiter, a woman named Councillor Voss, who wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to be the only thing holding her expression in place. And at the head of it, in the chair that was not quite a throne, but had been carved from the same ceremonial oak as the original throne. And no one pretended that was a coincidence, sat Caden. Sarah had not seen him in 7 years. She had prepared for this. She had stood in front of mirrors. She had practiced the shape of looking at him without feeling anything move beneath her ribs, the way you practice walking without a limp. Until the limp comes back the moment you are tired. She was already tired. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not the cold fury she had expected, not the calculated severity she had braced for. Something else. Something that lived in the space between recognition and confusion, as though her presence had answered a question he had not known he was asking. She did not let herself linger on that. She had learned 7 years ago, and many times since, that reading hope into Caden Ashvale's expressions was a particular kind of self-destruction she could not afford. Seraphine Morrow, Councillor Voss said, and her voice landed in the room like a hand flat on a table. You stand before the High Council of the Ashvale Pack, charged with unsanctioned use of Omega-class resonance magic within protected territory. You are further charged with the breach of the Exile Compact, specifically the clause prohibiting return to Northern Reaches land without council authorization. How do you answer these charges? The chamber was very still. The torchlight, actual torches, because the council chamber was ceremonial and certain pack traditions refused modernity, made the shadows on the walls move slowly, as if the room were breathing. Sarah looked at Councillor Voss. She let a beat pass, then 2, just long enough to feel the room's discomfort with her silence before she chose to end it. I answer them, Sarah said, by inviting the council to ask me what I actually did, and why. There was a sound around the table, not quite a murmur, not quite a reaction. Something between the two. Caden had not moved, had not spoken. His eyes had not left her face. Sarah kept her hands at her sides, her spine straight, and she waited for them to begin. The council had evidence, of course. They had reports. They had 3 different accounts of what had happened in the border marshes 4 nights ago, all 3 of which contained true facts arranged into a shape that produced a false conclusion, which was not quite the same thing as lying, and was therefore far more difficult to counter. Counselor Jas produced a written summary and began reading from it in a voice that suggested she found the task beneath her but would perform it with precision anyway. Sarah listened. She had the particular patience of someone who has had 7 years to cultivate stillness, and she used it now, standing before the curved table with her hands at her sides, and she catalogued the ways in which the council's account was technically accurate and substantively wrong. She would correct it. She would do so clearly, without performance, without the trembling deference that the council's architecture was designed to produce. She had rehearsed nothing, because rehearsed words had a particular hollow quality that audiences with power could always detect. Instead, she had done something older and more useful. She had spent 7 years living the truth of what had happened, carrying it the way you carry something too heavy to set down, and now she would simply open her hands. But first, because the council deserved to understand what they were actually looking at when they looked at her, she would take them back to the beginning, to the ceremony that had made her, broken her, and eventually, slowly, like iron folded into itself under heat, into something else entirely. 7 years ago, she had been 22 years old, an omega of middling pack rank, born to a family of modest lineage and considerable quiet pride. The Morrow family had never produced a figure of historical note, had never sat on the council, had never married into the Alpha bloodlines. They were the kind of family that kept the pack running without anyone pausing to examine the mechanism. Her mother had been a border mediator for 30 years. Her father had been a keeper of pack records, meticulous and gentle. They had raised Sarah to understand that her value was not contingent on her rank, which was a beautiful thing to be taught, and which the rest of the pack had never quite agreed with. Omegas occupied a specific position in the Ashfield pack's cosmology, not as servants, not precisely, but as the class whose magic was oriented inward and downward, toward binding and healing, and the maintenance of existing structures rather than toward expansion or command. Omega-class resonance ran in cool blue frequencies, steady and deep, where Alpha-class ran hot and gold and high. The mate bond, the oldest magic, the one that predated the pack structure itself, the one that no bloodline keeper fully understood despite 3 centuries of documentation, was supposed to operate across class lines without prejudice. Everyone said this. It was in the official texts. The official texts had also specified, in smaller print, that Alpha-Omega bonds were the most magically stable configuration, which meant that when an Alpha scented their mate and the mate was an Omega, it was considered a near-perfect pairing, a sign of favor from whatever ancient power governed such things. What the texts had not addressed because no one had thought it necessary was what an Omega was supposed to do if she looked at her fated Alpha and felt the bond pull at her like a tide, and looked at the man himself and thought, "Not yet, not like this, not when I don't know if you see me or only what I'm supposed to be." The binding ceremony was held at the full moon of the autumn solstice, in the great courtyard of the Ashvale seat, under open sky. It was the night on which new mate bonds were formally recognized and sealed, an old and elaborate ritual that the pack dressed up in gold and ceremony, the way all old wounds get dressed up in celebration. There were hundreds of people there, lanterns strung between the courtyard walls, the smell of heather smoke and pine resin, the high cold clarity of October air. Sarah had been presented, that was the word the formal invitation had used, presented as the fated Omega mate of Caden Ashfield, Alpha King. The bloodline keepers had confirmed it 3 weeks prior, after a resonance assessment that had left Sarah sitting lead in a small room, while 2 women in white wrote things down and did not meet her eyes. Her entire family had wept from relief and pride, and a complicated mixture of joy that had a warning in it somewhere, which Sarah had registered and set aside. She had stood in the courtyard in a dress the color of river ice, with her hair pinned, and she had watched Caden Ashvale stand at the central dais and extend one hand toward her in the ritual gesture of claiming recognition, and she had felt the bond rise in her chest like something being born, warm and specific and devastating in its certainty. And she had looked at his face. He was beautiful in the way that mountains are beautiful, not approachable, not welcoming, only massive and certain of its own permanence. He had dark hair and pale eyes and the particular expression of a man who had been performing authority for so long that the performance had become the man. He was looking at her the way she had watched him look at a new acquisition of land, with satisfaction, with assessment, with the proprietary warmth of someone receiving what is correctly theirs, not the way you look at a person you intend to know. She had understood in that moment, with the gold light of the ceremony lanterns swaying above them and 300 pack members watching, that if she took his hand, she would be taking his version of her, that she would become the mate of the Alpha King and cease to be Seraphine Morrow, the woman who had grown up in a house full of careful books and good arguments, who ran 5 miles every morning before anyone was awake and kept a private journal of old wolf lore that she studied for no reason except that she loved it, who had opinions about pack law and enough magic in her bloodline that the resonance assessment had made the keeper's instruments stutter in a way they had not quite explained. She would become a role, a position, a stabilizing element in his cosmology. The bond had been pulling at her, hard and certain. Her wrist, the mark was there already, manifested the moment the keepers had confirmed the bond. A pale curved line like a crescent moon low on her inner wrist had been burning. She had taken a breath, she had met his eyes, and she had said, quietly enough that only the front rows could hear it, but clearly enough that there was no ambiguity, "I'm not ready to accept." The silence that followed had a physical weight to it. She would never forget it. 300 people, and not one of them breathing, and the look on Caden's face shifting from satisfaction to something she had never seen there before, something that might have been the beginning of an actual feeling if it had been allowed to develop, before it closed back over into smoothness. He had lowered his hand. He had looked at her for 5 full seconds that lasted the rest of her life, and then he had turned to the High Arbiter and said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled, "The ceremony is postponed." Not rejected, postponed. She had thought, in her optimism, that this meant he had understood, that he would come to her later that night, or the next day, and ask her what she needed, ask her what had made her hesitate, and they would talk, really talk, the way she had been wanting to talk with someone her whole life. Instead, 3 days later, she had been handed the exile compact. It was presented by his secretary, not by Caden himself, not by anyone who could look her in the eye and explain it. A folded document in formal pack script that thanked her for her service to the bloodline. Noted that Alpha King had determined the mate bond to be insufficiently confirmed and had petitioned the bloodline keepers for a formal dissolution review, and specified the terms of her removal from Northern Reaches territory pending that review. The review, it turned out, would take 7 years. This was not unusual, the secretary had said, looking at a point somewhere past Sarah's left ear. Reviews of this complexity often took this long. She would be notified when it was complete. She had stood in her family's hallway holding the document, and her mother had come in from the kitchen and looked at her face and gone very still, in the way that only mothers go still when they understand that their child is being asked to carry something unfair, and there is nothing they can do about it but stay. "They'll give you what you need for the transition," her mother had said. Finally, meaning The pack would provide the standard relocation provisions for exiled members, which was technically a courtesy and practically a severance. "I know," Sarah had said. She had folded the document back along its creases. Her wrist had hurt badly enough that she had pressed her opposite hand over it without thinking. "I know they will." She had left 3 weeks later, before the first frost, with a pack on her back and the private journal she'd been keeping for 6 years, and a specific, cold-burning clarity about what she intended to do with the time she had been given. The border marshes of the northern reaches were not generally considered safe territory for a lone Omega in exile. This assessment was made by people who had never been a lone Omega in exile, and therefore had no accurate baseline for what such a person was capable of when given sufficient time, sufficient anger, and sufficient reason. Something the pack's classifications did not have a clean word for. Sarah had spent her first year in a small border town called Ashwick, far enough south to be outside the Exile Compact's restricted zone, but close enough that she could still feel the resonance of the pack's land magic in the ground under her feet on clear nights. A low hum like a power line, like something she had been plugged into her whole life and was now aware of only through its absence. She had taken work as a records assistant at the town's small archive, surrounded by exactly the bit of careful old documents that her father had raised her to love, and she had been very quiet and very watchful, and she had begun, for the first time without constraint, to study. The old wolf lore she'd been keeping in her private journal was only the beginning. In Ashwick's archive, there were texts that the Asheville Council's official library did not hold. Older documents, border documents, the kinds of records that accumulate in peripheral places precisely because they were not important enough to be curated and therefore never got purged. She read them all. She read about the resonance frequencies that bloodline keepers used in their assessments, and about the particular qualities of Omega-class magic that the official documentation consistently undersold, describing it as passive and binding, where the older texts used words that translated more accurately as generative and foundational. She read about the mate bond, specifically, about what it actually was, not what the pack said it was, not the mystical guarantee of perfect union, but what the oldest records described it as, which was something more like a living signal between two people whose magical frequencies were compatible enough to amplify each other. It's a signal that could be received or ignored, but could not be fabricated, and could not be destroyed, could not be destroyed. She read that sentence in a document dated 3 centuries before her birth, written in cramped brown ink on paper that had been folded and unfolded until the creases had become tears, and the tears had been lovingly mended with thin strips of new paper, and she put her hand over her wrist and felt the mark pulse under her thumb, and she sat with it for a long time. If the bond could not be destroyed, the dissolution review was a fiction. It took her another year to understand the full shape of what had been done, and she used that year well. She traveled. She had found in that first year of stillness that the Omega-class magic she carried was stronger outside pack territory than inside it, not because the pack suppressed it deliberately, or not only for that reason, but because pack resonance was an alpha-dominant field, and in an alpha-dominant field, Omega frequencies were naturally overwritten, the way a strong radio signal crowds out a weaker one. Outside the field, her signal ran clear and deep and much further than she had ever known it could reach. She found a teacher in a mountain settlement 4 days' travel from Ashwick, an older woman named Dilara, who had been born pack and chosen periphery 40 years ago, and who had the particular quality of competence that comes from spending decades doing a thing that no one is watching. Dilara taught her the difference between resonance she had been allowing and resonance she could direct. She taught her about the border marshes specifically, about the old territorial markers laid down in the land itself, the ones that predated the current pack structure and that responded to bloodline frequencies regardless of rank classification. She taught her about Omega-class magic's specific relationship to those markers, that Omegas were, in the old terminology, the land's own frequency, the class whose resonance mapped most directly onto the earth-deep patterns that the pack's founding magic had been built on top of. They told you your magic was passive, Delara said once, on a cold morning in her stone-walled kitchen, watching Sarah work a basic resonance exercise that was no longer basic in Sarah's hands. That's a management decision, not a fact. Sarah had kept that sentence in the same careful place. She kept other things that had changed the shape of how she understood her life. By the third year, she was not the same person who had stood in the courtyard at the binding ceremony in a river ice dress. She was harder, not in the sense of being cold. She had never been cold, had no interest in cold, but in the sense of being dense, of having been compressed by circumstance into something with more mass per unit volume than she had started with. She was still herself. She still ran every morning. She still kept her journals. She had more journals now, careful systematic documentation of everything she had learned and unlearned, the kind of records that her father would have been proud of and that the Ashvale bloodline keepers would have found uncomfortable. She had begun to understand that she had always been taking notes on her own captivity without quite knowing that was what she was doing. In the 4th year, she came back to the border, not into pack territory. The Exile Compact's terms were specific, and she had no intention of violating them before she was ready, because the legal architecture of her return mattered as much as the magic of it. But to the border, close enough to stand on the margin of Ashvale land without crossing it, close enough to put her hands in the marsh grass and feel the land's resonance rise up through her palms like a greeting, like something that had been waiting. The land knew her. This was not metaphor. This was the thing that the old texts had been describing when they used the word foundational. Omega frequencies resonated with the land's deep pattern in a way that alpha frequencies could command but could not match, the way a key fits a lock that a hammer can also open, but only one of them leaves the lock intact. The land's resonance moved up through the ground and into her, and she felt it align with the mark on her wrist and send back something that was not a message in words but carried the same information as relief. She stood there for a long time in the autumn marsh grass with cold water soaking the hems of her trousers and the sky going orange and low above the tree line, and she made a decision. She was come back on her terms when she was ready, and she was going to bring with her every piece of truth about what had been done to her and why, carried not as grievance but as evidence. And she was going to stand in front of whoever needed to hear it, and she was going to say it once, clearly, without performing either victimhood or triumph, and then she was going to let it be what it was. The preparation took 3 more years. In the 5th year, she formalized her knowledge, traveled to 2 other border settlements, worked with other practitioners of old resonance lore, began to understand that the skills she was developing had a specific application she had been circling without naming. Omega-class resonance, directed and active rather than passive and suppressed, had a specific relationship to territorial markers. It could, if the practitioner were trained and the bloodline connection were strong enough, interface directly with the pack's foundational land magic, not override it, not replace it, but read it, the way a very careful archivist can read a document that other people have been misquoting for a century. She discovered in the 5th year what she had suspected since the 4th, that the mate bond between herself and Caden Ashvale was not only intact, but had been, in magical terms, strengthening in her absence. This was because the bond was an Omega Anchord phenomenon. She had not known this, because the official documentation did not say this, but the old texts were clear. And because Omega magic grew in open ground, away from alpha dominance suppression, the bond on her end had been developing in a way that was apparently unprecedented in the bloodline records she could access. The mark on her wrist had changed over the years, still the pale crescent line, but deeper, somehow with a second faint curve beneath it, and on still nights when she did resonance work, it put off a light that she was careful not to examine too directly. She did not know what was happening on Caden's side of the bond. She had no way of knowing. She had heard things in border towns and at the edges of pack-adjacent social circles. That the Alpha King had not attempted another binding in 7 years, that the dissolution review had not concluded, that he was reported to be in good health and full authority, and that things were fine, everything was fine, the pack was thriving. She noticed that no one mentioned whether he was happy. In the 6th year, she returned to the border marshes for a second time and did something she had been building toward for 2 years. She interfaced with the territorial markers at depth that was, technically, only permitted by pack members in good standing. Which she was not, which was why she did it quietly at 3 in the morning on a night, with good cloud cover and no witnesses. What she found in the markers confirmed every reading she had done on the historical record. The original foundational magic of the Ashfield land, the stuff laid down 3 centuries ago, before the council existed, before the bloodline rank system had calcified into its current form, recognized 2 types of mate bond as valid anchors for the pack's territorial stability: alpha and cord bonds, which were documented and celebrated and formed the basis of the current lineage system, and omega anchored bonds, which the records described as the older and in several key respects deeper anchor, and which the current system had systematically declassified over the course of about 200 years, until they were no longer mentioned at all. Her bond, her specific bond, to Caden Ashvale, whose alpha bloodline was the direct lineal descendant of the family that had laid the original foundational magic down. She and Caden were not just a fated pairing. They were the pairing the land had been designed around, and the dissolution of their bond. The fiction of a dissolution review, which she now understood, had been instituted not out of Caden's genuine desire to release her, but because his counsel had advised him that an Omega, who said no was a destabilizing element, a problem to be managed, a signal to be suppressed, was slowly, measurably, causing the territorial markers to degrade. She had spent the 6th year documenting this. She had 3 separate field reports. She had cross-referenced them against historical accounts of territorial instability during periods of incomplete or broken mate bonds in pack history. She had done this with the same careful, systematic attention she had given to every other piece of this project, and when she was done, she had sat very quietly for a while and felt the weight of what she was holding. Then she had written to Delara and asked, in indirect language, whether Delara thought she was ready. Delara had written back in equally indirect language to tell her to stop asking questions she already knew the answer to. The 7th year, she had finished preparing and had crossed back into Northern Reaches territory 4 days ago, which was the event the council was currently classifying as a breach of the Exile Compact. What she had done in the border marshes on the night of her return, which the council's report described as unsanctioned use of Omega-class resonance magic within protected territory, was this. She had sat down in the marsh grass at the exact spot where she had stood twice before, at the exact juncture of 3 territorial markers, and she had put both hands in the earth, and she had done what the foundational magic was designed to receive, and the current system had spent 2 centuries forgetting was possible. She had sent a resonance pulse through the markers, not a command, not a claim, simply a presence, an Omega's frequency meeting the land's foundational frequency, and saying, in terms that only the very old magic would understand, "I'm here. I've come back. What do you want to show me?" And the land had shown her. She had been in the marsh grass for 4 hours and had emerged with 3 new data points: a significant amount of mud on her clothes and in her hair, and an absolutely clear picture of what was going to happen if the mate bond's degradation went on for another 7 years. She had walked the remaining distance to the Ashvale seat, taken a room at a border inn, washed the mud off, and waited for the summons. She had expected it to take perhaps 2 days. It had taken 9 hours, which meant someone had been watching for her. She let Counselor Voss finish her summary. She let the silence land, let it settle. She looked at the 6 council members in turn, taking her time the way Delara had taught her. Not a challenge, not a performance, but a simple communication that she was choosing when to begin, and they would wait accordingly. Then she looked at Caden. He had not moved. He was very still in the way that large, controlled things are, still the stillness of something with sufficient mass that movement is a decision rather than a reflex. He was watching her with the expression she still could not name, the one that lived between recognition and confusion. And it was no simpler or less devastating at sustained proximity than it had been when she first walked in. He had changed in 7 years. She had expected that, had tried to prepare for it, and still was not fully prepared. He was harder, too, in the same compressed way she was. But where hers had been voluntary, his looked like something that had happened to him without his permission. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there at the binding ceremony. His authority was the same. She could feel it in the room's texture, in the way the air organized itself around him, alpha-dominant field in full expression. But there was something underneath the authority that was not authority, something that had been pressing against the inside of it for long enough to leave a mark. She made herself look away. She looked at Counselor Voss. "I'll tell you what I did," she said, "and I'll tell you why. And I'll ask you to hold your formal determination until I've finished, because the truth of this situation has some bearing on whether the charges you've brought reflect an actual violation of pack law or a misclassification that the council will not want to be on record defending once I've laid it out." Counselor Voss's expression did not soften, but her hands flat on the table shifted almost imperceptibly. "You have the floor, Miss Morrow," she said. Sarah spoke for a long time. She had not rehearsed it, but it came out in order, the way truth generally does when you have been carrying it for long enough. Not in the order of events, but in the order of significance, starting with what mattered most and working out from there. She started with the territorial markers. She described what she had found in the border marshes 4 nights ago, not as mystical experience, but in the technical language of resonance assessment that the bloodline keepers would recognize and could not dismiss without also dismissing their own methodology. She quoted the field readings with the precision of someone who had been documenting field data for 3 years. She described the degradation patterns and referenced 2 comparable historical cases from the archived records, citing document locations that any keeper could verify. The bloodline keepers around the table had gone still in a different way from the pack lords. Their stillness had a quality of recognition in it, the specific frozen quality of experts hearing data that conflicts with their current position. She moved to the foundational magic. She explained what it was, not as she had discovered it, but as it was originally recorded, before the progressive declassification that the Council's own archives documented if anyone bothered to read the right sections. She was careful here, clear and unembellished, because this was the part most likely to be dismissed as interpretation if she was not precise. She presented the foundational magic's architecture as fact, supported by the historical record, and she was watching the room as she spoke, She could see the moment when the bloodline keepers understood where this was going. One of them, a woman on the far left, younger than the others, with the sharp, watchful quality of someone who read things carefully and remembered them, leaned very slightly forward. Sarah kept going. She explained the Omega Accord bond classification, the historical documentation, the 2-century declassification process, the specific implications for bonds of her class and Caden's bloodline. She was precise about what she was claiming and what she was not. She was not claiming conspiracy. She was not claiming deliberate suppression. She was asserting only what the documents showed and what the land's resonance had confirmed. She was an archivist's daughter. She knew how to present a case. She moved to the dissolution review. The dissolution review, initiated 7 years ago, she said, was legally valid under current PAC law. I want to be clear about that. I'm not claiming the council acted outside its authority. I'm claiming the council's authority to dissolve a mate bond of this specific type was superseded at the point of dissolution petition by foundational law that the current PAC legal code has not explicitly repealed, because the current PAC legal code did not know it needed to, because the older classification had been removed from the active teaching documents before any current council member was born. She paused. What that means, she said, is that the dissolution review does not have legal force. It cannot dissolve a bond that foundational law treats as a territorial anchor, and the exile compact that was generated from that review is therefore also without legal basis. The room was very quiet, which means I'm not in breach of the compact, she said, because the compact does not legally apply to me, because it was generated from a proceeding that foundational law does not recognize as having authority over a bond of this type. She stopped. She had said what needed to be said. She let it sit in the room the way you let a document sit, present and legible, available, to be read. Counselor Voss said nothing for a long moment. Her hands were still flat on the table, but her knuckles had gone slightly white at the pressure. The pack lords were looking at each other and then at the bloodline keepers, and the bloodline keepers were looking at the table. The young keeper on the far left was looking at Sarah. The silence stretched. It was not an uncomfortable silence for Sarah. She had inhabited more uncomfortable silences in 7 years than most people encounter in a lifetime, and she had learned that silence after truth is simply the world adjusting, and it needed the time it needed. And then, from the head of the table, in a voice that she felt in her sternum, the way you feel a low note from a cello, Caden spoke. Miss Morrow, he said. Seraphine. It was the first time she had heard her name in his voice in 7 years. She had been braced for it. She had prepared for it, and it still landed in her chest like a hand pressed flat against a door that had been held shut for a very long time. She met his eyes. How long, he said. Have you had these readings? His voice was controlled. His face was controlled. His eyes were not. In his eyes, there was something she had not seen there, at the binding ceremony, had not had the chance to see, because she had looked at his face and found it closed, and he had looked at her and found her refusal. And neither of them had had the opportunity to look again in 7 years. In his eyes, there was the specific expression of a man who is beginning to understand that something he thought was a loss was actually a lie, and that the lie was not hers. 3 years of documented readings, she said, and 7 years of understanding the shape of it. He was quiet. She watched him take that in, not just the facts, but the timeline, the 7 years, the weight of what that timeline implied. She watched something move in his face that he was not quite suppressing, something that had been pressing against the inside of his control for long enough that the pressure itself had become visible. The territorial degradation, he said. How advanced is it? Measurable and accelerating, she said. I have the field reports. I can give them to the bloodline keepers for verification. But I want to be direct with you. This is not the most important thing in this room. He went very still. No, he said after a moment. I don't expect it is. The most important thing in this room, Sarah said, and she heard her voice stay level and steady, and she was grateful for every morning of the last 7 years that had been practice for this, is whether you understand what was done, not what I did, what was done to us. Whether you understand that the night of the binding ceremony, I was not refusing you. I was asking you to see me, and whether you understand that the answer your counsel gave to that, which you allowed, was to make my absence into law. She was not performing, she was not trembling, she was not speaking loudly. This was the particular quality that Dilara had called quiet truth, the kind that did not require amplification because it was made of the right material, and the right material carried. Caden had gone very still in a way that was different from his earlier stillness. His earlier stillness had been authority at rest. This was something being held together with great deliberate care at some cost. I allowed it, he said, and the 3 words carried their own weight, the specific weight of a man not distributing the blame, but accepting his share of it in full. You did, she said. She was not going to give him the comfort of her saying, it was all right, because it wasn't. And this mattered too much for comfort to replace accuracy, and there are consequences to it that are not only personal. The land is showing the effects. That's why I came back. The territorial degradation is real and documented, and it will continue to worsen until the foundational bond is either properly ratified or formally and correctly addressed under the right legal framework, not the current one, the foundational one. The young bloodline keeper on the far left, her name, Sarah, had since gathered from a whispered exchange between 2 of the pack lords, was Keeper Ansel, and she had the distinction of being the first keeper appointed under 40 in the last 6 decades, spoke for the first time. You're describing a process that was removed from active protocol before any keeper currently serving completed their training. I know, Sarah said. I can walk you through the documentation. I have the original texts, the transitional documents, and the current code cross-referenced. It will take time to verify. I expect you'll want to verify it independently, which is exactly right, but I want you to understand that I didn't come back to make an argument. I came back to present evidence. What you do with it is your determination. She was aware, as she said this, that what she was doing was the opposite of what an Omega in her position was expected to do. She was not petitioning, she was not appealing. She was not performing humility or distress, or the particular strategic vulnerability that people used when they wanted something from those with more power. She was presenting evidence with the confidence of someone who had done the work, and she was leaving the response to the people in the room. It was not arrogance. It was the specific stance of someone who has nothing left to pretend. Counselor Voss spoke. Her voice was still even, still tight. But something in the architecture of her certainty had shifted, like a building that has been load assessed and found to be less solid than its exterior suggests. The council will need to deliberate on the documentation you've described. We would require access to the field reports and the historical sources before any formal determination. Of course, Sarah said. This does not constitute a suspension of the charges, Voss said, and then paused and added, in a tone that cost her something. But it does constitute an adjournment of this session pending review of the materials you've cited. It was the thing that Counselor Voss was capable of giving at this moment, given the constraints of the architecture she had been operating inside, and Sarah recognized it for what it was. Not agreement, not apology, but a woman of intelligence encountering evidence she could not immediately refute, doing what such a woman does, which is to pause. Thank you, Sarah said simply. The pack lords were speaking to each other in low voices. Keeper Ansel had produced a small notebook and was writing something with focused intensity. Two of the other keepers had the particular expression of people reassessing a position they had held for a long time without examining, and Caden stood up. He was very tall. She had forgotten, or not forgotten, but not known how to carry the memory of it correctly. He stood at the head of the table, and the room organized itself around him without anyone deciding it should, the way rooms with pack leaders in them always did, and he said to the council, "Adjourn, review the materials. Present your assessment to me in 48 hours. Not a question, not a suggestion." The council adjourned. The keepers gathered their things. The pack lords filed out. Councillor Voss left last, pausing at the door to look back at Sarah with an expression that was complex and unreadable and contained. Sarah thought, a fraction of something that might eventually become respect, if given enough distance and enough honesty, but was not there yet. The door closed. They were alone in the council chamber. Caden Ashvale and Seraphine Morrow. For the first time in 7 years, in the room carved from the same bedrock the pack had been built on, with the torches moving slowly on the walls and the old magic in the stone pressing upward through the floor. Sarah's wrist was burning. She did not press her thumb against it. She let it burn. She stood where she was. 3 meters from the table he stood beside, and she waited, because she had said what needed to be said, and now it was his turn and she was not going to fill the silence ends for him. He looked at her for a long time. It was not the assessing look he had given her at the binding ceremony, the proprietary warmth of acquisition. It was not the closed, controlled expression she had watched him maintain throughout the council session. It was something more like the expression she had seen break through in his eyes when she'd said 7 years of understanding the shape of it, that specific undefended quality of a person confronting the actual scale of something they had allowed to happen. "You studied," he said. It was not quite a statement, not quite a question. It was the sound of someone narrating what they were seeing in order to believe it. "For 6 years," she said, "systematically, and then you came back, when I had something worth coming back with." He was quiet again. He moved from behind the table, not toward her, just to the side, as though he needed to be adjacent to the furniture rather than defined by it. He stood with one hand on the back of a council chair, looking at the floor, and she could see him thinking, could see the thoughts arriving and being processed with the particular quality of a man who is good at thinking, and is arriving at a conclusion he cannot argue with. "The night of the ceremony," he said, not looking up, "I told myself I understood what you'd done, that you were frightened, that you would come around given time." "I know," Sarah said. "I was told, by Voss and the senior keepers, that Omegas frequently needed more time to accept the bond, that it was a function of the class dynamic, a residual resistance that resolved itself, that the best response was to formalize the review and give you space." He finally looked up. His pale eyes were direct and unshielded in a way she had never seen them before. "They were wrong, and I knew they were wrong, and I didn't push back." "Why not?" she asked, not as a challenge, as a genuine question, the kind she had been carrying for 7 years without expecting to be able to ask. He looked at her steadily. "Because it was easier," he said, "to believe the explanation that didn't require me to examine what you were actually saying." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She thought it might be the most honest thing he had said in a long time, possibly to anyone, and the cost of it was visible in the particular way he held himself. Upright, direct, without the usual layering of authority between himself and the admission. "What was I actually saying?" she asked. "That you were a person," he said, "not a role, not a magical match. A person who was being asked to hand herself over to something she hadn't been invited into." He paused. "And that I had not, up to that point, given you any reason to trust that I knew the difference." Sarah's chest was very tight. Her wrist was still burning. She looked at this man she had known only from a distance. Through the binding ceremony, through the years of his absence, through the evidence of his choices, through the slow gathering understanding she had been building like. Everyone builds their understanding of the people they are bound to, in fragments and inference, and the spaces between what is said and what is meant. And she let herself feel, for the first time without immediately corralling it, the specific thing she had been feeling about him for 7 years. Not the bond. The bond was always there, reliable and aching and certain. This was something under the bond or alongside it. Something that had been developing in her the way her magic had developed, in open ground, without suppression, with the particular expansiveness of things allowed to grow in the direction they actually wanted to go. Something that was specifically about him, the man she was watching, as he held himself accountable with the same quality of attention he probably used for everything important, the man who had failed her and knew it, and was not trying to reduce that, or distribute it, or manage her response to it. She had not expected to like him. That was the truth of it. She had prepared for the bond, had prepared for the arguments, had prepared for a dozen versions of this confrontation. She had not prepared for the possibility that the man himself, the actual man, would turn out to have the kind of interior life that she could recognize. I have documentation for everything I presented, she said. And more. I brought everything. I know you did, he said. You're your father's daughter. She went very still. You knew my father. He kept pack records for 30 years, Caden said. I was 12 when I met him the first time. He was explaining a border dispute resolution to my father with more patience and precision than I'd seen anyone use when talking to an alpha. I've thought about that over the years, about where you learned to do what you just did in this room. She took a slow breath. Something in the back of her throat was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the argument, and everything to do with the mention of her father in a sentence about precision and patience, and she let herself feel it briefly before she put it aside for later. The territorial degradation is real, she said. That's not leverage. I want you to understand that. I'm not here to use the land's condition to force a particular outcome. I know, he said. I came back because it was time and because the evidence was complete and because the compact's legal basis was non-existent from the beginning, and I wanted that established in a room with witnesses. She paused. I did not come back to resume what was started at the binding ceremony. Something moved across his face. I understand, he said carefully. I came back, she said, to be here, on my own terms, under my own authority, in my own pack territory, which is what I was trying to tell you 7 years ago when I couldn't say it that clearly. And now? He asked. His voice was very quiet now, she said. I'm saying it clearly. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I have work to do with the territorial markers. The degradation will need continued monitoring, and I'm the most qualified person to do it, which the keepers will confirm once they've reviewed my field reports. I intend to do that work. I intend to do it as a full pack member in standing, which the foundational law documents establish as my right, regardless of the Council's current classification of my rank. She held his gaze. And beyond that, whatever happens between you and me happens because we both choose it, clearly, with full understanding, not because a ceremony and a piece of bloodline magic said it should. He looked at her for a long time. The torchlight moved. The old stone breathed its cold mineral breath around them. Her wrist was burning and she was letting it burn, not pressing against it, just feeling it as information rather than something to suppress. You became something, he said, in 7 years. I always was something, she said. You didn't have the context for it. He absorbed that. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who has been presented with a true statement. and is electing to receive it rather than counter it. Will you give me the time, he said, to develop the context? It was not a romantic overture. It was something more precise than that, an acknowledgement of the actual deficit, a request for the actual opportunity. She recognized the quality of it because it was the same quality she had been trying for in the council chamber. Honest, proportionate, stripped of performance. She considered it. She let herself consider it fully, without hurrying toward either the safety of yes or the safety of no. She thought about the mark on her wrist and the light it put off on still nights. She thought about the foundational magic and what the land had shown her in the border marshes. She thought about her father explaining things with patience and precision to a 12-year-old boy who would grow up to be an alpha, who could, in the end, hold himself accountable in a room with no audience. She thought about what she had said to Dilara, that she was not going back to be what she had been before, was not going back to be a role or a position or a stabilizing element in someone else's cosmology, that she was going back as herself, fully or not at all. She thought about the fact that she had just stood in front of a high council and presented 7 years of systematic documented work, clearly, without trembling, and that in that presentation, the thing the pack had spent 2 centuries calling her limitation, the omega-class frequency, the passive binding magic, the foundational rather expensive nature of what she carried, had turned out to be the most important thing in the room. What they had called her weakness was the thing the land had been built on. What they had called her deficiency was the frequency the whole structure needed to function. What they had called her need for management had turned out to be knowledge they lacked. She had said no at the binding ceremony, because she had known, without having the language for it, that the story she was being handed did not tell the truth about what she was, and she had spent 7 years in exile, in study, in open ground, finding the language. She looked at Caden. Yes, she said, you can have the time, but I want you to understand what that means. It means I stay because I choose to, and I leave if I choose to. And what we build is built from actual knowledge of each other, not from what the bond says we should feel. I don't want the bond to do the work that we should do. I understand, he said. And then, after a pause, can I ask you something? Yes. The night of the ceremony, he said. When you said you weren't ready, what were you looking for? What would have made you say yes? She thought about it. It was a real question and it deserved a real answer. And she took the time to find one that was accurate rather than convenient. I was looking for evidence, she said, that you were curious about me. Not about the bond, not about the match, not about the magical compatibility. About me, the specific person. I wanted to see you look at me the way you look at something you want to understand, not the way you look at something you want to have. He was quiet. She watched the particular quality of his silence. It was the silence of a man turning something over carefully, not to find a counter to it, but to understand its full shape. I understand, he said again, and this time, those words carried more weight because they were not reflexive, because there was a pause before them that was honest. I know you do, she said, and she meant it. She would not have said yes to the time if she hadn't believed he meant it. She had been a very good archivist for 7 years, and she knew the difference between a document that was false and a document that was incomplete. And what she saw in him now was a man who had been operating from an incomplete record and had just finally been given access to the missing material. She reached down, pulled back her sleeve, and showed him her wrist. The mark was visible in the torchlight, not just the pale crescent line she had always carried, but the second curve beneath it, the deepening that had happened in exile, and the faint light that it gave off on still nights, and which was, here in the room's living magic, just barely visible at the edges. He looked at it. She watched something happen in his face that she would spend a long time afterward finding the right word for. Not wonder. Exactly, though that was close. Something older than wonder. Something that had the quality of recognition, not just of the mark, but of what the mark meant, which was all of it. The 7 years, and the study, and the border marshes, and her hands in the earth, and the land saying, I'm here, I've been here, I've been waiting with a patience I chose, rather than a patience that was required of me. He reached out slowly, with the question in the gesture. Not a claiming gesture, not the ritual hand of the binding ceremony. Just a man reaching toward something carefully, giving it the opportunity to pull back. She did not pull back. She let him take her hand, the marked one, and hold it in both of his, and she felt the bond rise in her chest like a tide. Warm and certain, and completely itself, and she felt it meet something from his direction that was not the controlled alpha authority he wore in the council chamber, not the smooth performance of the binding ceremony, but something real and specific, and a little unsteady, the way real things are. There's a lot of work to do, she said. Her voice was steady, her chest was full, and her wrist was burning, and she was not pressing against it. I know, he said. Will you tell me where to start? She thought about the border marshes, the territorial markers, the 3 field reports, the 2-century gap in the bloodline keeper's active teaching documents, the foundational law she had spent 3 years documenting from the margins of places where careful things got kept without being managed. She thought about the particular pleasure of that work. Not the difficulty of it, not the exile, but the work itself. The mornings with documents, and the evenings with the land's resonance moving up through her palms, and the deep, sustaining satisfaction of knowing something true. We start with the keepers, she said. There's a lot of lost knowledge in those archives. Keeper Ansel looked like she understood the implications. She'll be a good ally. We restore the full documentation of foundational law to Act Protocol. We address the territorial markers before the degradation goes another season without intervention. We reclassify the current bond under the correct framework. She looked up at him, and then, when all of that is done, and the pack is stable, and the law is correct, and there are no other pressing structural repairs to deal with, you can take me to dinner somewhere quiet and ask me things about myself, and I will ask you things about yourself, and we will find out what we actually are to each other when none of the architecture is in the way. His mouth curved. It was a small thing, not the broad expression of a man performing warmth, just a real, specific thing that moved in the corner of his mouth and reached his eyes and stayed there. That will take months, he said. Yes, she said, it will. I'm a very thorough person. I'm starting to understand that, he said. The torches moved. The stone breathed its cold breath. The old magic was very present, very steady. The foundational frequency running deep through the floor and up through their joined hands, and neither of them performing anything about it, just letting it be what it was, old, intact, growing, having had 7 years of open ground to grow in. In the weeks that followed, the council chamber saw more activity than it had in a generation. Keeper Ansel worked through the historical archives with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting her whole career for permission to do exactly this, and she emerged at intervals with documents that confirmed, extended, and, in several cases, exceeded what Sarah had brought back from the border settlements. The foundational law texts were not simply archived knowledge. They were, once restored to active reading, a living system with more internal coherence than the current code had. And the bloodline keepers found themselves in the position of being corrected by their own profession's history, which Ansel handled with grace, and the other keepers handled with varying degrees of dignity. Counselor Voss said nothing about any of this for 2 weeks, and then requested a private meeting with Sarah in which she spent 45 minutes verifying specific document citations and asking pointed technical questions about the resonance field methodology, and said nothing personal at all. And at the end of the meeting stood up and extended her hand and said, in the tone of someone who has weighed a thing and committed to an honest response, "Your documentation is thorough. I won't say I had no part in the shape of what happened 7 years ago. I won't revisit it now. Beyond saying that I acted with what I believed was the pack's best interest, and I understand that's insufficient." It was, Sarah thought, the most honest thing she had heard from someone in power about the specific kind of harm that was done without intention but not without consequence. And she shook her hand and said, "Thank you," and meant it in the way that you mean things when they are hard to give. The territorial markers responded to Sarah's ongoing work with a measurable improvement in resonance stability within the first month. Keeper Ansel observed and documented this with careful scientific impartiality, and then, in her session notes, used the phrase unprecedented improvement rate, which circulated among the keepers with the particular speed of information that confirms what people had been quietly beginning to believe. Sarah lived in a set of rooms in the main house that were comfortable and not elaborate, which was how she liked her spaces. She had her journals. She had access to the pack archives. She ran every morning before anyone else was awake. On the evenings she did resonance work in the border marshes. Cadence sometimes accompanied her and sometimes didn't, and when he did they mostly talked about the work and sometimes about other things, and occasionally about nothing at all, which was in some ways the most important category. She was learning him. It was slower than the bond wanted it to be, and faster than she'd been afraid it might have to be. He was not the man she had read in the binding ceremony, the massive, certain permanence with no interior weather. He was someone who had been conducting himself for a long time at a level of authority that left very little room for uncertainty, and who therefore had a great deal of uncertainty that had been compelled to live somewhere other than his face. He was funny, unexpectedly, in the dry, specific way of people who have been very serious for a long time. He asked her questions with the same focused attention he gave to council reports, and he listened to the answers the way people who are genuinely curious listen, not waiting for the gap to speak, but actually there. He made mistakes. He deferred to established framework when he should have deferred to her twice in early council sessions, and she called him on it both times, quietly and directly, and he received it with the same clean accountability he had shown in the council chamber. The third time it happened, she noticed that it didn't, because he had adjusted. She did not make a point of this. She simply noted it in the same internal archive she kept for all important things and moved on. 4 months after the council session, the formal reclassification of their bond, under foundational law, was completed by the bloodline keepers in a small official ceremony that involved a great deal less gold light and ceremony than the original binding had been planned to have, which Sarah preferred because the original ceremony's architecture had been one of the things wrong with it. The reclassification was witnessed by Keeper Ansel and 2-pack lords and Councillor Voss, who attended, without being asked, which was the kind of thing Sarah filed under the category of people being better than you prepared for. The territorial markers after the reclassification showed a resonance pattern that Ansel described in her documentation as consistent with original foundational design, a phrase that the oldest texts would have recognized, and that meant the land was doing what the land had been built to do, which was hold and bind and remember. The dinner Sarah had mentioned, the quiet dinner, the conversation without structural pressures, the one in which they would find out what they actually were, happened on a Thursday evening, which was as mundane a day as Tuesday, and which Sarah decided she preferred for different reasons now. The restaurant was small and not particularly noteworthy, and they were there for 3 hours, and she asked him things, and he asked her things, and some of the answers were surprising, and some were exactly what she'd expected, and all of them were real. Afterward, walking back through the pack seats courtyard, the same courtyard where the binding ceremony had been held, same walls, different lanterns, the heather smoke replaced by the clean cold smell of late winter giving ground to early spring. He took her hand, the marked one, and she let him, and they walked through the courtyard without anyone watching them, and without any ceremony at all. Her wrist was warm, not burning. Warm, the specific temperature of something that has been waiting long enough to understand that it was not being denied, but only, finally, being allowed to arrive in the right conditions, under the right sky, in the company of two people who had earned, through 7 years of separate hard work and 4 months of careful shared work, the right to something real. She thought about the border marshes and the cold water in her boots and the land saying, "I'm here." She thought about Delara's kitchen and the morning light coming through the stone-framed window, and stop asking questions you already know the answer to. She thought about her father Thasser's careful books and the document she had held in the hallway, folded along its creases, and her mother going very still, and the pack on her back, and the cold certainty that had carried her the whole length of it. She had said no once, to a version of her life that did not have room in it for who she actually was. She had spent 7 years in the space that no had made, and she had filled it methodically and without regret, with everything she needed to come back carrying. And she had come back, not summoned, not retrieved, not restored by anyone else's grace. She had come back on her own authority, with her own knowledge, into her own land, and she had opened her hands and let the truth fall out in a granite room, with torchlight and witnesses. And it had been enough. It had been exactly enough. She looked up at the winter sky, which was very clear and very cold and full of stars, and she felt the land's resonance rise through her feet from the courtyard stone. And the mark on her wrist put off its faint light, and beside her Caden Ashvale, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, held her hand like a man who finally understood what he was holding, and Seraphine Morrow, who had once said no and meant it with every frequency she carried, said nothing at all, because some things did not require a word, only a presence, and she had learned, in 7 years of open ground, exactly how to be present without asking anyone's permission, and she intended, from this night and all the nights that followed, to go on doing precisely that.